Carve out a little space in your closet because I have another beautiful dress pattern for you today. Sometimes I feel so lucky when I find a great pattern and it's free. This one has so many desirable details, and we're going to take it step by step and do it all together for a beautiful outcome. This pattern is the pleated summer dress by In the Folds, and you can find it at Peppermint magazine. I've left the link below so that you can print it out and sew it along with me today. Cut out all your pieces, mark your notches, grab a couple of buttons, and let's get started. The first step is to prepare our neckline binding. Fold each of the long edges to the inside by 3/8 of an inch, both sides, and press them both in place. Pressing these creases into the material will help us when we apply the neckline to the bodice. Now grab your front bodice piece and place the right side of your neckline binding to the wrong side of your bodice. Match the centers and pin in place. Continue pinning the binding to the neckline. Now stitch your binding to your neckline with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Trim and grade the seam that you just sewed. I'm using pinking shears. And now turn your bodice to the right side. Fold your neckband over to the right side of the garment along the seam line, tucking that raw edge that's pressed at 3/8 of an inch underneath that fold, and pin in place. Now that you've brought that neckline to the front of the garment, fold it along the seam that we sewed with the raw edges tucked underneath. Take it to your machine and edge stitch all along the bottom of this neckline from shoulder to shoulder. Now grab your placket piece and fold both of the outside edges to the wrong side by 3/8 of an inch. On your pattern piece, you have a Y-shaped indicator that will be our slashing line. Transfer this onto your pattern with a tracing wheel and tracing paper. Then, using a ruler and chalk, I'm going to mark a line 3/8 of an inch from both sides of that line. I'm also going to mark a line on my fabric 3/8 of an inch away from this dot at the Y area, as well as 3/8 of an inch away from the top of my fabric. Now place the right side of your placket on the wrong side of your bodice. The 3/8 inch mark that we made at the top of our bodice will be where we align our material with the top of the neckline. So the bodice will extend 3/8 of an inch over that center point of the neckline, and pin in place. Continue pinning all along the rectangle that you drew onto your fabric, which is 3/8 of an inch on either side of that middle Y, making sure that your placket is aligned with the center of your bodice. Now stitches pinned all around this rectangle that surround the Y cutting guide. And once that rectangle is stitched, you can cut down your Y shape and into the arms of the Y, clipping to but not through those corner stitches. Now flip your placket to the right side of your garment. Give those seams and corners a really good press. At the top of this shorter side of your placket, you have a notch on the inner side indicating your fold line. Fold your placket along that notch and pin just the placket in place. And pin also catching that folded side of the seam that we pressed earlier. And then we're going to sew the top of this placket with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, which should fall in line with your neckline. So we're just sewing the portion that extends beyond the neckline, and sewing from one side of the placket to the other just to seal it and lock in those folded seams. Trim this seam and turn it right side out, and then press this placket so that the corner of this opening aligns with the notch mark at the bottom of your placket so that you press a nice straight line. Pin the side of this placket, tucking that raw pressed under seam allowance to the inside. Pin from the top of the neckline only as far as this placket opening. Edge stitch from the top of your neckline all the way to the pin that marks the end of the placket, back stitching at your last stitch to secure. Now we're going to start working on the other side of our placket. On the edge of your fabric, you have a notch that indicates that 3/8 of an inch that we've already pressed under, and then next to it you have another notch which indicates where to fold this placket. So fold this placket in line with that second notch, right sides together, and pin in place, catching this first fold underneath. Where the placket meets the neckline, you should have another notch. Fold your placket once more, right sides together at this notch, and pin in place. And then we're going to sew across the top edge of the placket just as we did on the other side with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Remember, you're just stitching the folds of this placket together and not catching your neckline. And then you can trim this seam and clip the corners, and then turn this placket right side out, pushing out your corners. Once that's turned to the right side, align this center of your placket on top of the edge of the other placket that we sewed in place. And then on the opposite side of the placket, you're going to press another clean line from the top point that aligns with the notch that's marked on the bottom of this placket piece. Also gone ahead and folded this placket in half, so all of the layers of this center rectangle of your placket all line up neatly with one another. And it consists of these accordion folds. Take the bottom section and fold it toward the other side. And then take the outermost section and flip it over itself. And we're going to sew along this bottom edge with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Once it's sewn, trim your seam, turn it right side out, poking out your corners. So now your placket has a nice finished bottom. And now you can pin this placket in place, making sure that you cover and conceal our original stitching line, and pin from your neckline to the bottom of the placket. And then from the bottom of the placket, measure up 2 inches and mark a straight horizontal stitching line across the placket. And now we're going to edge stitch all along this side of our placket all the way to the bottom, pivoting at the bottom and stitching across, pivoting again and coming back up and doing one more pivot to come across this stitching line that we just drew. Backstitch at the beginning and the end to secure. Now I'm going to use the markings that I transferred from my pattern piece to sew buttonholes for the 2 upper buttons. And then following the markings, the X marks that you transferred from your pattern piece onto your placket, sew on your buttons. With a tracing wheel and tracing paper, transfer your darts to your front bodice. To form your dart, mark a straight line from each of the notches to the point indicated for your size. Fold your dart in half, pin through one dart leg and out the other, all the way down. Do this for both darts. Now go to your machine and stitch your darts, stitching from the outside edge to the point, leaving tails at the end so that you can tie them in knots. Now grab your back bodice piece and one of your yoke pieces, place them right sides together, and pin the upper edge. Sew this seam with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and then press the seam up toward the yoke. Now place your front and back bodice pieces right sides together, aligning your shoulder seams, and start pinning from the outer edge toward the end of your neckline. The back bodice will extend beyond the front bodice at this point because we still have to finish the neckline at the back bodice. So just pin it in place as it is. Stitch these shoulder seams with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now grab your remaining yoke piece, place it right sides together with the other yoke piece, sandwiching the front bodice in between. So the right side of this new yoke piece will face the wrong side of your front bodice. And pin your shoulder seams. And also pin your yokes together along the neckline. We're going to stitch these layers together using 2 seam allowances. The shoulders will be stitched with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and the neckline connecting the yokes will be stitched with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So starting at one end of your shoulder, stitch with a 1/2 inch seam allowance until you get to the point where your front neckline ends. You can feel between the layers where your binding is. This should be about 3/8 of an inch away from your neckline. Pivot there, and then continue sewing with a 3/8 inch seam allowance around this neckline, pivoting again where you can feel the neckline of your front bodice in between the layers, and continue stitching this shoulder seam with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now trim these corners. Clip into this neckline too, but not through your stitching. And then open out your yoke. Press your seam allowance to your inner yoke, and we're going to understitch the seam allowance, sewing the actual seam allowance to this inner yoke 1/8 of an inch away from our original stitching line. As you approach the corners that connect the back neckline to the shoulder seams, it will be difficult for your presser foot to get cleanly into those corners, so just stitch as far as you can. I've gone ahead and pressed the raw edge of my inner yoke to the wrong side by 1/2 an inch. Now I'm going to take my inner yoke and place it on top of the other yoke seam so that they're wrong sides together. The folded edge of your inner yoke should just cover the seam line of your other yoke piece. And pin in place. And now we're going to sew from the right side of the garment, stitching in the ditch of the original seam line, periodically checking underneath to make sure that you're catching the inner fold of your inner yoke. Now place your front and back bodice right sides together and pin your side seams. Sew these side seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and then use your serger to finish the edges. Press and prepare your armhole binding pieces in the same way that we did for the neckline binding, pressing both of the raw edges to the wrong side by 3/8 of an inch. Take the short edges and place them right sides together, temporarily opening up those folds that you created with your iron, and pin together your short edges. Sew both short edges of both of your binding pieces with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now trim your seam allowances by about half. Now grab your bodice piece, place the right side of your binding with the wrong side of your bodice, aligning the seam of your binding with the underarm seam of your bodice, and pin in place. Continue pinning your binding all around the armhole. And now sew that binding to your armhole all the way around with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Once it's sewn, you can trim the seams and clip the curves. And then you're going to bring your binding over to the right side of the garment, folding it over the seam that you just sewed, folding over the pressed 3/8 of an inch on the other side underneath. This is the same exact process that we did for the neckline. Now that this seam is encased with your armhole binding, go to your machine and edge stitch close to the inner fold all the way around your armhole, and repeat the whole process for your other armhole as well. Now grab your front skirt piece and we'll start sewing our pleats. With your front skirt piece folded in half, right sides facing, place a pin at the top of your material at the first notch closest to your fold, and we're going to sew a straight vertical line extending from this notch to the dot that you should have transferred from your pattern piece. My dot on my pattern piece is 1 5/8 inch away from the top of the piece. So now I'm going to sew down this straight line from the top of my skirt, stopping at the dot indicated on my pattern. Now that that's sewn, I'm going to open up my front skirt and continue this process for each of my pleats. So here is one of my notches and another one of my notches, and this is the outside edge of my front skirt. I'm going to fold this portion of my skirt in half, right sides together so that the notches meet, and then pin this folded section in place. And then I'll draw another line from the top of my fabric extending from the notch 1 5/8 of an inch so that my line meets the dot that I've transferred from my pattern piece. And then I'm going to sew again from the top of my skirt to this point the same way I did for that center pleat. Continue the same exact process for all of your pleats. You should have 9 pleats on your front piece and 7 pleats for your back piece. Now working from the inside of your garment, you're going to press each of your pleats flat so that the center of the pleat is pressed flat against the stitching line that you made. Once you've pressed all your pleats flat, pin the top edges in place, and then you're going to baste across the top of each of your pleats from one side to the other with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Do the basting of your pleats for both your front skirt and your back skirt. Use a serger to finish the outside edges of your pocket, and do this for all 4 pockets separately. Place your pocket right sides together with your front skirt. Match up the notches along the side seam and pin in place. And do this at both side seams. Now stitch your pockets to the skirt with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Once your pockets are attached, serge the entire side seam from top to bottom and do this for both seams. Now lay out your pocket so that it's flat, and we're going to understitch this seam to the pocket. Pressing the seam that we just sewed toward the pocket, sew this seam to the pocket 1/8 of an inch away from the original stitching line, and do this for both pockets. Follow the same exact steps to attach your remaining pocket pieces to your back skirt. Place your front and back skirts right sides together and pin around the pocket curve and down the remainder of the side seam. And then we're going to stitch as pinned with a 1/2 inch seam allowance from the top of your pocket around the curve and down the remainder of the seam. Do this for both sides of your skirt. We originally sewed our pockets to the skirt with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, but the true seam allowance of this side of the skirt is 1/2 inch. This will allow us to do some additional stitching at the top and bottom of the pocket to reinforce them. So 1/8 of an inch away from your original pocket sewing stitch, you're going to sew from the top of your skirt to the pocket notch that we used to match the pocket to the skirt. Stop your stitch here with a back stitch and continue stitching from the bottom notch of your pocket down to the bottom of your pocket so that your stitching begins to fall in line with the 1/2 inch seam allowance that we did for the bottom of the skirt. And do this for both sides of your skirt. Now turn your pocket over to the front of the skirt along its seam line and pin the pocket to the front of the skirt. Do this on both sides. And now baste these tops of the pockets to the front of the skirt. Now match up your skirt and your bodice right sides together, taking a moment to double check that you are pinning the front of your bodice to the front of your skirt. Match up your centers and your side seams and continue pinning all the way around. Sew your bodice to your skirt with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and then serge the seam all the way around. Now the very last step is to hem the bottom of the dress. I've gone ahead and serged all the way around my bottom hem to finish the edges, and I've also gone ahead and pressed up the hem 2 inches all the way around, and now I'm going to pin it in place. And then you're going to sew your bottom hem close to your serging stitches all the way around, and you are all done with your dress.
Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you subscribe for more videos and sewing inspiration. I'll see you next time.